Okay. This year's symposium could hardly be more timely since the ascent of China as a global economic power has become ever more difficult for Americans and the rest of the world to ignore. Brown's celebration of a year of China this academic year is one local manifestation of China's rise to prominence, and the fact that the current chief economist of the World Bank is, for the first time, a Chinese economist is another sign. And we are honored and pleased to have him, Dr. Justin Lin, present with us today. I'll say more about Dr. Lin this evening when I introduce him again in this room at 7:30 for our Fein lecture. For now, let me just say, to be very brief, that Dr. Lin received his PhD in economics from the University of Chicago in 1986, and that between then and his appointment as at the World Bank, he has worked tirelessly to establish the modern economics discipline in China after the decades in which the study of economics in the usual sense was banned on ideological grounds. Dr. Lin is the author of numerous influential articles and books, and his talk this evening has the same title as his latest book, which is Demystifying China's Economy. We're equally honored to have on our panel this afternoon two of America's most distinguished experts on China's economy. Dwight Perkins, this is Dwight, Dwight Perkins has been on the faculty of Harvard University and has been a leading researcher on China's economy since the early 1960s. Among his dozens of positions and titles, he was chair of Harvard's Department of Economics from 1977 to 1980. He was director of the Harvard Institute for International Development from 1980 to 1995, and he was director of the Harvard University Asia Center from 2002 to 2005. His numerous books include the presciently titled China, Asia's Next Economic Giant, which was published in 1986. So he seems to have gotten that right. And he has also written many other important books on China and also on other Asian economies, including Korea. And he is, in addition, the co-author of one of the world's best-selling textbooks on economic development, which some of you have studied from. It's called Economics of Development, and it covers the developing world as a whole, including but not limited to China and Asia. The other leading expert on the economy of China who we're delighted to have with us this afternoon is Professor Barry Naughton of the University of California at San Diego. Professor Naughton earned his PhD in economics at Yale University in 1986, and he has been on the faculty of the Graduate School of International Relations and Pacific Studies at UC San Diego since 1988. He too is the author of numerous scholarly articles and books, including the 1995 book Growing Out of the Plan, Chinese Economic Reform 1978 to 93, and he has written what may be the most widely used English language textbook on China's economy. In any event, this book is used in no fewer than 3 undergraduate classes in the economics department at Brown, and the book is titled The Chinese Economy, Transitions and Growth, published in 2007. The topic of our panel this afternoon is not only China's economy, but what the rise of China's economy means for the world economy. And to maximize the amount of time available for questions and discussion, what we're going to do is we're asking each of the 3 panelists to speak for just a few minutes about a part of their take on that issue, and then to leave as much time as possible for questions, answers, discussion. At 5:15, we hope to wrap up, and we'll move outside of the room where there'll be some refreshments and the possibility of further discussion with the panelists and with one another. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce first Dr. Justin Lin, the chief economist of the World Bank, to make his remarks.
Thank you very much, Bruce. And it's quite an honor for me to speak in the same panel with Dwight Perkins, and who I consider as my teachers, because when I was a student in Chicago, I read a lot. I read a lot. His articles and book, and to learn economics, also to learn about China. And also with Barry Naughton, because I think we graduated in the same years, we work in the same fields, and so we have a lot of exchanges in the past also. And since this evening, I'm going to give a talk on the Chinese economy. And in this panel, I just like to talk about 2 points, which I will not cover in this evening. The first one is whether China can continue the dynamic economic growth as in the past 30 years. You know that in the past 30 years, China grew at the rate of 9.9% continuously. And how about in the coming 10 years, 20 years? Can China continue those kind of performance? Certainly, yes or no will have a big implication for the world. And the second one I'd like to discuss, the implication of China's growth for other developing countries. For the coming 10, 20 years, in effect, I'm quite optimistic about the possibility for China to continue 8% or more growth rate. The reason I have those kind of confidence is because for a developing country to have a dynamic growth of 7, 8, 9, 10%, the most important mechanism and potential is the so-called advantage of backwardness. We know that continuous technological innovation is the driving force for dynamic economic growth. But for a developing country, China today, the per capita income is only about $4,500, less than 1/10 of the US per capita income. That means that the technological level in China is still much lower than US, than other high-income countries. And with this kind of technological gap, China can still benefit from the advantage of backwardness by adopting technology, by learning technology from the high-income country. It's a way for technological innovation. And that way, actually, the cost is low, the risk is very small, and that is the reason why good performing country, they can have 8%, 9%, 10% growth rate, and a high-income country can only have 2% or 3% growth rate. And the issue is that China used that potential for 30 years already. How large is the potential? And my measurement is that according to the purchasing power parities, which I have the figures 2008, China's per capita income was 21% of the US per capita income. And that was similar to Japan in 1951, exactly 21% of Japan's per capita income of the US. And that was the same as Taiwan in 1975. That was the same as Korea in 1977. Then I look, Japan from 1951 to 1971, its growth rate was 8.7% per year, continuously for 20 years. Or 9.3%, I'm sorry, 9.3% continuously for 20 years. For Taiwan, from 71 to 95, 20 years, the average growth rate was 8.4% per year. And for Korea, from 77 to 97, the average annual growth rate was 7.8% per year. We know that China followed the East Asian model of growth. If with the same technological gap with the high-income country, Japan could maintain 20 years or 9.6% growth rate. Taiwan could maintain the 8.4% growth rate. Korea could maintain 7.8% growth rate. There's no reason that China does not have those kind of potential. So potentially, China should be able to maintain at least another 20 years of dynamic economic growth rate. It's 8% or even more for another 20 years. And for Japan to maintain 20 years of dynamic economic growth, plus currency appreciation and so on, by the time of 1971, Japan's per capita income increased from 21% of the US to 65% of US per capita income, measured by purchasing power parity. For Taiwan, China, okay. From 75 to 95, it increased from 21% to 54%. For Korea, it's from 21% to 51%. So I would say 20 years from now, the per capita income in China, measured by purchasing power parity, is likely to be about 50% of the US per capita income. Certainly, measured by market exchange rate, depending on the appreciation, it can be a quarter, it can be 30%. But no matter by which measure, 2030, I think China will be the largest economy in the whole world. That's something for sure. And if China continue this kind of dynamic economic growth, what's its implication for the developing country, especially for the low-income country in the world? Well, I think many people pay attention to, if China continue this kind of growth rate, China certainly will create a demand for the resources. And a lot of low-income countries, they are resources providers. That's one thing many people pay attention to. And I agree. But more importantly, for the developing country, my argument is that if we deep up a huge potential for other countries to enter into the industrial sector, the manufacturing sectors, and allow them to have similar dynamic economic growth. We know that when a country like China move up the income, and its industry also need to move up the higher ladders. Currently, you know that most of this product that China produce, export to the US market, are very labor intensive, low value added. But if China continue to have this kind of dynamic economic growth, the income will increase, wage rate will increase, and the labor intensive sectors, China will lose the competitive advantages. But when China loses competitive advantage in the labor intensive sectors, it will allow other lower income countries to enter and start with a manufacturing sector in labor intensive and gradually move up the ladders, just like China did. And currently, the China's per capita income measured by purchasing power parity and so on was very close to 1950s, 1960s Japanese situation. 80s, 70s, 80s Korea situation. And we know that in 1960s, when Japan continued this kind of dynamic economic growth, Japan relocated its labor-intensive sector to Korea, to Taiwan, to Hong Kong, to Singapore, and helped them to start the industrialization process, so they turned into so-called East Asian tigers. And in the 1980s, Korea, Taiwan, and so on also relocate their labor-intensive sector to mainland China, help China to have past 30 years of dynamic economic growth. And China currently reached that stage. But there's one thing different, that is scale. In 1960s, the manufacturing sectors in Japan employed 9.7 million workers. And those kind of labor-intensive jobs relocate to Korea, to Taiwan, help them to industrialize. In 1980s, Korea employed 2.4 million workers. Taiwan employed less than 2 million workers. And Singapore, less than 1 million. And Hong Kong, about 1 million. Those jobs relocate to China, help China to enter into the dynamic economic growth I just mentioned. But this time, the manufacturing sector in China employed 85 million workers in those kind of low-skill, labor-intensive sectors. Currently, the wage rate for the unskilled workers, the definition of unskilled worker was those high school students right after the school and go to the factory, their wage rate. Currently in China, it is about $350 per month. $350 per month. In 10 years' time, the wage rate for the unskilled workers will be at least 1,000. And China will lose the competitive advantages in this kind of labor-intensive sectors. And so those 85 million jobs need to be relocated. But the scale is so huge because if you look into Africa, both Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. Their population is 1 billion, but they only employ 10 million workers in the manufacturing sectors. And if you look into low-income country altogether, low-income country by definition now have 850 million population. Again, they employ less than 10 million workers in manufacturing sectors. And now there's a huge 81 million jobs need to be relocated. And if China continues this kind of growth rate, it will benefit a lot of other low-income countries if they can find a way to get some portion of those kind of jobs. If they can do that, I'm sure they can also grow at 7, 8, or 9% continuously for 1 decade, 2 decades, or 3 decades. Thank you.
Professor Perkins will speak next.
I'm going to sound like I totally disagree with Justin. In fact, I think if we sat down with our data, we might have some minor differences, but you're going to be spared that. But I'm going to give you a different perspective on what's happening and a somewhat different conclusion. What I'm going to do is first I want to basically take off from where he spoke, and I want to talk about what does 9.9% growth carried forward for 2 decades mean? What does it actually imply for the production in China and vis-a-vis the rest of the world? Say the same thing about the current levels of exports of China. Talk a little bit about what the implications of that for the world would be, although I think when I give you the total numbers as contrasted to the per capita numbers, they will shock at least a lot of people. And then I'm going to tell you why it's not going to happen. The growth rate is going to slow down. Whether it's going to slow down in 6 years or 8 years or 10 years, the chances of it going for 20 years at anything like the current rate. It won't slow to 0. There will still be a lot of progress, but it will slow substantially. Now, I'm starting, and I'm going to use the exchange rate calculations because in terms of world impact, it's the exchange rate calculations. I'll come back to purchasing power parity. They're not all that different. They're somewhat different. But China's GDP today is $6 trillion, just taking their value in renminbi and dividing it by the official exchange rate. If you use the exchange rate that most economists outside of China believe is more appropriate, it would be more like $8 trillion. That is, the Chinese currency is undervalued in the eyes of most economists outside of China. At $8 trillion at 9.9%, it would grow to $20 trillion in 10 years and $53 trillion in 20 years. The U.S. GDP today is between 14 and 15 trillion dollars. I should have written the exact figure down. That is, Chinese GDP 10 years from now will be significantly higher than that of the U.S., and it'll be 4 times that of the U.S. 20 years from now if it grows at these rates. So that is an enormous increase. Total world GDP is 63 trillion at the moment. China with 53 trillion and 20. Now the world will have grown in that in between, so it won't be. China won't actually be equal to the rest of the world combined, but it won't be all that far different either. Now then the question is, okay, what are the implications of that? Well, in some ways I'll leave it up to your imagination. You look at the impact of the U.S. on the world economy, and now you talk about creating 4 U.S. economies over a very short period of time. That means a much higher per capita income for the people in China, but it also means probably soaring energy and mineral prices. China today already produces something like 60% of the world's steel, and therefore is the major source of demand for iron ore. Energy We are profligate users of energy. China is also an even more profligate user of it per dollar GDP. That'll come down, but it would have to come down a lot, not to have enormous impact. So, and as Justin has pointed out, that does not mean China will have caught up with the U.S. in per capita terms. That's all of it happens in 20 years. If we're talking 50 years or something, it's a different ballgame. Second, world exports. World exports today are $18 trillion. China's are 1.6 trillion. They're the largest exporter in the world, close to Germany, a little bit ahead of the U.S. That's 9% of the world. Chinese exports in real terms today over the last 5 years have grown at 13, 14% per capita. Not per capita, 13, 14% in real terms. Again, if you project that forward for 10 years and for 20 years, if you take total world exports, I mean, China in 2010 reached, I'm sorry, just a second, I've got to get these figures straight before the total world exports are 18 trillion. China's world exports will be about 20 trillion. Again, world exports will grow in that time, but if that's the pace at which Chinese exports are going to continue to grow, then effectively most people in the world will be exporting to China or importing from China. Because basically China will account for a very large part of world trade. There will be much less trade between other countries because basically China will dominate. Now, second point. As I say, I'll leave it to your imagination to, to think about all the adjustments the world would have to make to accommodate that. Second point. I don't think it's going to happen at anything like that pace. And there are, I think, a number of reasons for expecting China's growth rate to slow. Not to 2% or 3%, but certainly down to 5% or 6%, and probably sooner rather than later. What are the reasons? Well, I can only do it since we have very short time frame. First, if you look at all other countries that have reached high income status, all but 2 or 3 have slowed down between $10,000 and $16,000 per capita income in purchasing power parity terms. That's true of Japan, of South Korea, of Taiwan, all of which slowed down at about $13,000 per capita. China, at the current purchasing power parity, is already halfway there. At 7% per capita growth for another decade, it will be at the top end of that. Why has it happened? Well, there are structural things that happen in the course of growth. You run out of a labor surplus. That has the ability to transfer large amounts of low productivity labor into much higher productivity manufacturing. China has already reached a point where the surplus is now, most people between the ages of 18 and 40 who are registered in the rural areas are in fact not working in agriculture. They're working in the cities. The labor surplus is coming to an end. Manufacturing, which grows more rapidly typically than services, particularly in the early stages, accounts for a lot of these high rates of growth in these countries. That levels off, and as the share of GDP begins to decline, and China is reaching the point where that decline would take place. So the structural reasons that go with growth slowing down and slowing down markedly in all of these countries. And then there is the fact that China's current strategy of growth, in my view, is probably not sustainable for a long period. China has done a remarkable job over the last, particularly the last decade, of building absolutely first world quality infrastructure. As China, after the years of the Soviet type model, had lousy housing. The average family had about 200 square feet for a family of 3. Today, the average family has 900 and some square feet for a family of 3. That has involved a massive housing program, and in fact, over the last 10 years, China has built 14.5 billion square meters, or 145 billion square feet of new housing. And that just over that period, that's enough to house 360 million people at a higher level. It's an extraordinary achievement, but it's also an achievement that has, to a substantial degree, been completed. China cannot continue expanding investment in housing at that pace, even taking into account the need for dealing with migrants and so on. China has, a lot of the infrastructure has been this magnificent transport system. China, when I first went in the mid-1970s, had the trunk highways were 2-lane paved highways. Most of the other highways were gravel and dirt. Now you have a interstate or inter-province system of high-speed highways, multi-lane highways, that is longer than the U.S. system. And that's built really almost entirely in the last 10 years. You have high-speed trains to a limited degree. You're going to have 4 north-south, 4 east-west trains. That's going to be done at the current pace over the next few years. You have airport. When I first went to Beijing in '74, there was a little tiny little building, and you walked in. Then they built a pretty good-sized airport, then a bigger airport, and then they built this wonderful modern airport that you go into today. But China has also modernized all of the provincial airports, even ones that have relatively limited number of flights. They have big, fancy new airports, and the cities have subway lines all over the place and so on. But it's been an extraordinary achievement of this last 10 years. But the reason for this achievement has been, to a substantial degree, that China not only had the capacity to do it, which was extraordinary, but it also had to do it. China, the problem China faces is only 35% of GDP goes to consumption of the people in China. 65% has to be covered by something else, and that's government consumption, and 50% of it is an investment. That, to sustain the full employment of their resources, China has to maintain that massive investment. And going forward, it's not at all clear that China needs anything like. In fact, I think it clearly is not going to need this kind of massive public investment in transport infrastructure. That's been done. It's not going to need it in housing to the same degree. It needs more housing, but not to the same degree. And all of that suggests to me that, in fact, China is going to slow down. It's going to slow down fairly soon. Whether it's 5 years from now or 8 years from now, I have no way of knowing, because it's partly a government decision of how long to keep on pushing this infrastructure development. But the infrastructure productivity is going to fall if they keep on doing similar sorts of things. So all of which is to say, there's nothing wrong with what they've done. They've in fact done a magnificent job, but the fact is it's going to come to an end, at least at that kind of pace, and the rest of the world will have to adjust to China. And it'll be a major challenge to the rest of the world, but it's going to be over a much longer period of time than 20 years.
Thank you very much. Our speakers are doing a magnificent job of being brief. I know they have hours and that they'd like to talk about each of these points. We'll move right on to Professor Naughton.
Thank you. It's already a tough act to follow, and it's only been going on for 20 minutes. Help, what should I do? Let me start out by talking a little bit, let me springboard off of the points that Dwight made at the end of his remark. And that is, as we look back on China's tremendous success over the last 20 years, of course, there are many, many reasons for it, features for it. But certainly one of the key elements has been a growth strategy that privileged pouring resources into investment, pouring resources into the kind of things that economies need for growth. Dwight already mentioned infrastructure. I think quickly we should also add, recall this is also extended to human capital in recent years, where in the late 90s, China was only graduating 1 million people a year from college. A couple of years ago, it surpassed 5 million from college. So we're also accumulating human capital very rapidly. And so this accumulation of physical and human capital, I think we should understand in a kind of two-handed way. I know economists are always doing on the one hand, on the other hand, but I think in this case we absolutely have to, because it means two very different things. On the one hand, the fact that China has invested so much in physical and human capital means that in some respects, China is better positioned to go through the set of structural changes that Dwight is talking about than perhaps any other country has ever been before. So there is reason to believe that China can make the transition to a different kind of economic growth, to a middle income growth dynamic, in a way that, after all, like Dwight does, also looks back to the experience of Japan and Taiwan and Korea in past decades and learns something from it and figures out tricks to maintain the growth process. But to do that, what's necessary? I mean, if we think of this economy that is, absolutely pouring resources into investment. I mean, right, as Dwight said, 35% of GDP for household consumption. We have never seen in world history an economy that devoted so little of its output to consumption. We've never seen in world history an economy that invested so much of its output in world consumption, in investment. So far, that's been a fantastically successful model, this sort of investing out ahead of demand. But in order for it to continue, we have to have faith that the institutional mechanisms that are shaping this investment, that are guiding this investment, are able to continue to put it into relatively high productivity capital, both physical capital and human capital. It means we have to have faith that the institutions are adapting appropriately to the rapid change in factor prices, in factor scarcities that is clearly happening in China. And here's where I'm a little more worried than Justin. I see Chinese economic policy adapting slowly and sometimes in the wrong direction to the demands of a much more affluent, capable, and sophisticated Chinese population. Now, part of this, of course, is because of the impact of the global financial crisis. The global financial crisis came, China took a deep breath and it said, we're not going to go down there, we're going to invest, we're going to step up our investment, and so we had this surge of investment in China in 2009 that allowed China to bridge over the global financial crisis, and let's face it, we're all grateful for that, because China acted as a stabilizer on the global economy that put a floor under how bad things could have been. In April 2009, we were all very, very glad that Chinese demand for initially raw materials and then other things helped to stabilize the economy. But since that time, China has maintained this extremely high investment rate. It's maintained high growth rates, but increasingly we look at a China that is, and here I'm coming down more on Dwight's side, we're looking at a China that's pouring resources into investments that have probably an incrementally declining productivity, incrementally declining utilization rates, and incrementally declining positive impact on the next stage of the economy. When we look at each individual sector, we tend to see elements of this, right? The infrastructure is going into play. The housing market is slowing down. Well-educated people are coming out of college, but they're underemployed. In other words, we're starting to see an economy that is pouring resources into investment, but there's increasing little indicators that this investment is starting to slip a little in terms of its positive future impact on economic growth. Now, why is that? I think it's complicated. Some of it is structural. But I also think that One of the main reasons is that as this economy moves into middle income growth, the government should be drawing back a little bit and allowing more sophisticated, complex goods to be demanded by and produced by a smaller and more diverse production sector. And instead, what we're getting is a government that is determined to maintain high-speed growth and therefore keeps re-intervening in individual little sectors and places in order to keep the pressure on, to keep the pace of growth and the pace of capital accumulation at a high rate. There's a term in China that's been much debated lately. It's called, in Chinese, 国进民退, meaning that the private economy recedes while the public economy reasserts itself. Now, this is much debated in China, not because anybody thinks China's going back to a state-run economy. It isn't. Not even because the share of state ownership in the overall economy is increasing. It's not. But because in many little areas, direct government action and direct government ownership are being used to replace indirect market-driven operations, particularly at a time when the economy is becoming more sophisticated. Let me give you one example, but it's a big example. It's a complex example with a lot of implications for us. China has a program formalized in late 2009 called Strategic Emerging Industries. 7 industries, but actually these 7 industries are actually 35 when you break them down. And if you had to sit around and kind of try and list the 35, you'd probably come up with it pretty easily on your own, because it's pretty much the same list you'd get for the United States or for Germany or for Japan. These are the global cutting-edge sectors like integrated circuit design and large commercial airliners and things like that. There's currently a kind of a wave of investment going on in China in these strategic emerging industries. It's a big part of the 12th five-year plan. Every local government has their initiatives. Lots of investment is going on, but hold it. This is not catch-up. This is not building airports that look like airports in France. These are building industries that are designed to compete with the cutting-edge industries all over the world. It's hard. It's a really difficult thing to do. It's something where catch-up type strategies probably aren't going to work that well. Now, maybe they'll work in some of these cases. So this is going to have a big impact on us either way it works. In those cases where the Chinese initiatives work, we're going to be challenged by dramatic new industries that compete directly with ours and have a lower cost basis. And that's going to be a challenge for us. In other cases, it's not going to work, and the challenge is going to be, how does the Chinese government readjust this structure, liquidate investment projects that don't work, and move to a different kind of growth strategy? So I'm an optimist about the Chinese economy, but I'm also a worrier. I worry a lot that the new reliance, or maybe we should say the re-reliance on government initiative as a growth driver to keep growth high is piling up problems that we might see erupt. It used to be that when the Chinese economy went through strong fluctuations, it was a problem for China, but not for the rest of the world. That era is done. We know now that when there are fluctuations in China, our markets are going to respond, our economies are going to respond. We're all dependent on Chinese growth. I look forward to a China that still has robust growth, but I think we're also going to see fluctuations coming out of China as it grapples with these strategy problems that will also have a big impact on our lives.
Thank you very much.
Now, I know that it will be an even greater challenge than sticking to the short time that I gave each of the panelists to ask them not to immediately comment on each other's remarks, because that could go on for the rest of the time too. The purpose of this panel is for you, the Brown community, Brown students, some faculty, et cetera, to come with your questions if you have them. So I'd like to invite some questions from the audience at this point, and if it's directed to a particular member of the panel or to everyone, just let us know. Thank you.
Hi, I have a question for Dr. Lin. So, when you were making your argument for optimism for Chinese growth, you're mostly using statistical terms like that things happened in other countries before. So I'd like to know what, if China did have that kind of growth, what would you imagine it coming from? What sector? And what competitive advantage would it come from? And especially wish you address the issues brought up by the other two professors that China is a special case in which we only have 35% of GDP as consumption. It seems that this issue in most Asian countries, it seems China is most severe. The smallest share of GDP is consumption, and how that could play out. Thank you.
Should we
Yes.
respond immediately?
Yes.
Well, this is a very good question. And certainly it's based on the statistic analysis. But it has a theoretical foundation behind that. What I said was the advantage of backwardness, the gap between you and the frontier countries. And those kind of statistics is indicators about how large the gap it is. And as I said, well, currently the gap China facing is similar to Japan facing in 1950s, Korea, Taiwan facing in the 1970s. And if you took the courses about East Asian economic development, you know that China after the 79 basically followed similar development strategies. Tap into the potential of advantage of backwardness and integrate in the global economy and so have a global trade and so on. And because the gap is similar, so the potential is similar. Certainly, here I'd like to answer, one of the reasons to make Dwight a little bit more pessimistic than I do. He looked into the level of income. He said that all the, Taiwan, Korea, or Japan, when they reach 13,000 US dollars, their growth rate started to decline. This level. But US income continued to grow, right? So if you look into the gap, when China reached the per capita income of 13,000, then the gap will still be very huge compared to Taiwan, Korea, that in the 13,000. For example, when Taiwan, Korea, their per capita income was 13,000, that was 97, 98, right? At that time, their per capita income was already 50%.
71 in China.
Yeah.
90s, yes.
Right, and so now China just catching up from, 172 to Korea, Taiwan in 95, 96. So the gap is still so large, so it was possible for China to continue to have those kind of growth rate. Regarding high saving, I'll talk about that. There are some structural issues, but at the same time, all the East Asian economies have high savings. And that was one of the very important force for the East Asian economy that can maintain a much higher growth rate than other economies. China is a little bit higher, but compared to, let's say, Singapore. Singapore's per capita the saving rate has been, 45% for 5 decades already. And Korea, Taiwan was also very high, although not as high as China, but they are also very high.
Okay, I see a question in the back there, yes. Yes.
This is a general question for anyone on the panel, and I'm just curious about income inequality as a nation's economy grows and the implications that might have for social cohesion.
We all, is this working or?
Yeah.
Okay, is it now working? Yeah, okay, it's my voice, not the machine. That's not working. you know, the inequality in China is to a substantial degree the product of market forces. It's not so much a result of direct government action. Essentially, when you have a large rural labor force with significantly lower incomes than in the urban areas, that holds down wages in the urban areas as well. And so the main, you do get people who earn large profits on various kinds of investments that get very high incomes, but most of the population is getting a relatively low incomes. So there's not, the thing that will eventually change that and hopefully begin to right that, and it's beginning to happen already, is that labor surplus disappears and you basically get very rapid growth in wages, which you are now getting in China. As real wages are growing at 11, 12, 13% faster than GDP, which if that keeps up will hopefully reduce the inequality that is now very large, particularly the rural-urban gap, which has been widening steadily. Now, how does that relate to tension? I would say that in China, that aspect itself is not a major source of tension. The major source of tension are things like people, companies and local government officials making deals with land that basically take the land from the farmers at very low prices, then in effect sell them at much higher prices to the factory or whatever needs the land. And that abuse, it has led to riots all over rural China in recent years. And more generally, when you get a person with very strong political government connections ending up being very rich without obviously creating anything, that is a source of tension. But the actual, the population doesn't sit down and look at the Gini coefficient and say, oops, it's gone from 0.4 to 0.45 and therefore we're going to riot. It's more of these direct abuses, I think.
Second row. Yes.
I have a question for both Professor Lin and Professor Norton. Could you compare the role of FDI on China today and Japan, Taiwan, South Korea in the past? We all know that the three East Asian developmental states were very export-driven during their high growth rate, but export-driven does not necessarily mean FDI-driven. And as far as I know, FDI actually play a much smaller role, both in proportion and in absolute amount, in the manufacturing industry of the Japan, Taiwan, and Korea. So does this imply that China is having perhaps a very fundamentally different pattern of growth? Thanks.
Okay, I can respond. Yes, to some extent, you are right. FDI played a much larger role than...
What is FDI? Excuse me. What is FDI?
Foreign direct investment.
Foreign direct investment did not play much role in Japan, in Korea, but it play a much larger role in China. But it played a much larger role in China only after 93. Before 92, the FDI in China was also very small. And because if you look into the FDI investment as a percentage of Chinese investment, before 92, it was less than 5%. And only after 92, it increased to 12%, 15%, and the highest was 20%, now declined again. That's one thing. But I think that also related to the change in the international global production system. Because now you have a lot of intra-industrial trade, like the global production network. And that was something new up to the 1980s because of improvement in transportation and information ages. And this can also be seen from the fact that the global trade, its growth rate was twice as high as the global GDP growth rate. And through this kind of international production networks, you're going to see more of this kind of foreign direct investment in order to tap into the competitive advantage of each country.
Let me add something to that. That's, of course, completely 100% right. And then if we add on the fact that in the last 5 years, the relative importance of FDI in China has decreased substantially. So you gave these percentages. I think that was percentage of total fixed capital formation, right? And, you know, from a height of around 15% in the late 90s, this number has now gone down to less than 5%. So foreign firms are a lot less important in China today than they were a decade ago. And that's in part because as China evolves into these more sophisticated sectors, especially service sectors, most of these remain relatively closed to foreign investors.
Hi, this question is for Dr. Lin. China is currently the largest creditor to the United States. I'm wondering what if one day China just stops buying the US treasuries and stop lending money to the US? Like, how would this contribute to the political and economic relationship, or perhaps even tension between Beijing and Washington?
Well, I think Larry Summers is going to give a talk tomorrow evening. He might be a better person to answer your question because he, phrased that it's a special term called mutually threat, something like that. But I think that if you look into the economic rationalities, I don't think China has the incentive to rock the boat for two reasons. Because the stability of the U.S. economy is important for the global economy and also for the growth of China. And secondly, China has such a large stake, as you said, large creditor. If the U.S. economy was, have a huge trouble, then it will reduce the value of those kind of investment. So I think Chinese people are rational. And that's how the worry you have, or the worry Larry Summers has, I think that I will sleep much better than he does.
Hi, my name is Allison Schaefer. I was just wondering as to whether our panelists would mind speaking to the implications of a potential default in the U.S. or Europe on export-driven emerging economies.
This is a question about the U.S. And none of us are really specialists on the U.S. So that is. But well, actually, all three of us live here now at the moment. But European default, meaning Greece and possibly some other Southern European countries, and American default, are very different. How do you default when you can print the money to pay back? The problem that Greece has is that it can't print, the money. It can't print as many euros as is needed. So that, the only way the U.S. would default is when we do something stupid, like the congressional standoff on this issue. Where we actually refuse to pay. It's like a millionaire sitting there with a pile of money and he owes the money and he says, I just won't pay. Well, that's a default. That would be the equivalent in the U.S. Because we can't. But as far as Europe is concerned, clearly the danger of a massive default across. No one thinks that a default by Greece by itself. The problem is when you get to Italy and Spain, where the numbers are much, much larger, whether there's enough money in for the Europeans. I mean, the Germans and the French probably have the money, but anyway, that's a ram.
Like the effect of a recession or double dip in the U.S. or just European crisis, what that is going to do to the export-driven emerging economies.
Well, I mean, as it did in 2009, it'll lead to a sharp decline in either in the growth rate of exports, or in 2009 it actually led to a decline in exports in many of these countries, and that obviously for those countries that were dependent on at least partly on exports to keep the growth going, that hurt them. It wasn't. China is back to growing very rapidly again now, however, in terms of exports.
So I'm interested in the significance of China's size to its expectation of growth rate, because both Dr. Justin Lin and Dwight mentioned that we will, you guys both use Taiwan and Korean and Singapore as an example, as an analogy to make an expectation of China. Whereas in reality, if you see the Chinese economic performance, like the most prosperous areas is moving from the coastline into the innerland, and you will see it's a very dynamic, continuous transformation. So do you think like this kind of the size, population-wise and geographic-wise, will be a battery of the whole, the dynamic of economic growth, or a resistance force towards the expectation?
You get first shot.
Well, thank you very much. I think a large economy, as you mentioned, China, certainly the per capita income for the whole nation currently is about $4,500. But you have regional differences. So the hinterland, their wage rate was about 30% lower than the coastal provinces for the unskilled workers. And so because of that, you do see the movement of some of the labor-intensive manufacturing sectors to the hinterland provinces to take advantage of low wage cost. Plus, Dwight just mentioned the highway system, the infrastructure improvement that reduce the transportation cost. But overall, my sense is that China's wage rate will continue to grow, no matter it's for the coastal provinces or for the hinterland provinces. And when China reach, let's say, 1,000 per month for the unskilled workers, and the coastal provinces maybe 2,000, hinterland provinces at least 1,500, hinterland provinces maybe $750 at least. And under the kind of situation, certainly China will also relocate to its labor-intensive sector to other countries. For a large country, there are some advantages because of the internal migration of the job will be easier than international migration of job. However, it's impossible for China just to maintain all those jobs in domestic economy.
Thank you.
I'll give it a try. It's a very difficult question. I once did a paper years ago trying to see what the impact of size was on a variety of things, and for the most part, there wasn't much of it. The size itself didn't drive. But the one thing that where size has mattered historically is that the importance of foreign trade in large countries tends to be much smaller. I mean, Simon Kuznets demonstrated that many decades ago. China has actually, in some ways, not been following that pattern. It's become, it's been a very heavily export-oriented. And I think, but potentially China has a huge domestic market and could have, full scale of all kinds of industries within the domestic market and therefore would focus more on the domestic market. The Chinese government would like to do that, saying that doing it, however, is not a nice, straightforward. And this would get us back to why is the consumption level so low? Because ultimately, to produce for the domestic market, there have to be people who are going to demand for the domestic market. Right now, that domestic demand is coming from the government, saying a lot of it's coming from the government for the infrastructure and things of that sort, moving water into the North China. You know, there are advantages and disadvantages to size in this context. I mean, China, in my view, cannot continue to expand exports at the current rate. But then the question is, what will it do? So, I mean, that's a very inadequate answer, to put it mildly. But
There are a lot of hands in the back. Have a second to back row.
Professor Norton, you had said that China is having physical and human capital and that its middle class is growing. Now, this would mean that it would have a large amount of consumers. That being said, historically, when a country is faced with this conundrum, they would find colonies in which to export their goods. That being said, should developing countries, specifically in Latin America and in Africa, be wary of establishing bilateral trade agreements with China? Why or why not?
Great question. So, I mean, we can imagine a really ideal kind of virtuous cycle for the world economy. Right? This virtuous cycle involves Chinese saving surpluses, instead of being recycled into low-yielding U.S. Treasury bills, instead, go into high productivity investments in other parts of the developing world. If that were accompanied by other parts of the developing world adopting at least one strand of the Chinese model, if there is a Chinese model, namely pushing up their investment rates and building out their infrastructure faster, that's actually a win-win-win scenario, because it creates demand also in the developed countries for the kind of high quality machinery and things like that U.S. and Germany and Japan retain a comparative advantage in. So not only do I not think that's a danger, I think that would be highly productive. And the question is, how do we get there? How do we get China out of holding treasury bills, which I think $3 trillion is enough, basically, and move towards something more dynamic?
China is oftenly compared a lot to India, and I wanted to ask about India's role in competing with or helping China's development and its future implications with its relation to India. Any one of you?
who wants to try? Justin,
Why not try? I've been answering to many questions.
I get to answer all the questions where I don't know the answer. I've always often thought that I really should spend a lot of time really coming to grips with the Indian economy so that I could make the comparisons, because it gets back to this question of size. Is there something fundamentally different about countries of this size? And then every time I start getting involved trying to learn about India, it gets so complicated I get tired. The economies are really quite different. The growth of Indian economy is actually mainly in services. You hear a lot about the Bangalore, call centers and all that sort of thing. That's not it. It's more general services. And manufacturing actually is a lagging sector. India is also a country that has much less dependence on foreign trade. That is, it's been much more restrictive of foreign investment. It has not had the dynamism in exports, so it's depended more on this domestic demand so they're really, quite different. question earlier about the impact of the world recession on exports. Well, it wasn't a big problem for India because it wasn't, they aren't big exporters. So, so it makes for an interesting comparison. For long periods, India was held back by its politics, but then for a long period, China was held back by its politics. The difference is you got a dramatic change in China in 78, 79 in terms of policy. In India, you've got that somewhat slower, but nevertheless a movement in some respects in similar directions, but not entirely. And India, of course, the other big difference is India is a pluralistic democracy with all kinds of political pressures that China, for the most part, at least at this stage of its political development, does not have to deal with, and that has implications for long-term stability, which probably favor India, but for short-term and foreign direct investment, it can cause all kinds of problems. So
Professor Tan? Can you get the microphone down here? Well, while the microphone is moving, we didn't give enough credit to the Year of China people for sponsoring this event. So Professor Tan is the chair of the whole Year of China.
I raised my hand because this young lady in front has been raising her hand for the last 20 minutes, was not recognized. So I'm trying to grab the microphone and pass it on to her. Before I do that, I do want to ask a question, non-economics question. See, I'm a physics professor, so I think when I get hired, if I want to do a good job, I do a good job. It doesn't matter whether I'm Chinese or not. So what I'm questioning is, what's the role of a chief economist at World Bank? Now, I assume it's a big deal, you being first Chinese economist. Now, what really, in terms of your understanding the role of a chief economist, what does your particular background or qualification bring to this job? Now, you have the next question.
Well, the chief economist of the World Bank mainly has three functions. One is the chief advisor to the president and other senior management about the global economy, about the development economics, those kind of knowledge function. The second one, I also supervise the research division within the bank, and we have the largest group of economists working on development issue in the whole world. That is direct report to me. We have about 300. But there are other economists work in other divisions. They also indirect report to me, and that's more than 1,000. So that's a lot of function of management there also. And the third thing is some kind of spokesperson about the global issue. On behalf of the World Bank. So I do have to travel a lot. I need to consult with our clients' country about their economic issue and provide some consultancy to them, and also bring my knowledge about the global economy to them. So those are the three main functions of the chief economist at the World Bank. And I think that I'm lucky to be, the World Bank's chief economist at this challenging time, because it gives me a lot of opportunity to rethink many things which I learned in the past in the process of understanding the challenge in the world. And regarding my background, well, maybe you should ask the president of the World Bank to answer you, but from what I understand, it's a competitive process, because they have the selection committees, and then they have the long list, then the short list, and finally the president make a choice.
She has the microphone.
Oh, thanks, Professor. I'm blushing really badly now. So, at the risk of starting a debate just as we're reaching the end of our time, I know that Professor Naughton mentioned the role of the government in China's growth. So I wanted to know what Justin Lin has to say about government intervention in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. In fact, I just published a symposium about a reflection of the development economics, because development economics became an independent subdiscipline in the modern economics after the Second World War. And from 1950s to the 1970s, the development economics in general focused on the government intervention, try to address the issue of market failures. But that kind of government intervention did not perform well. So after the late 1970s, early 1980s, it switched to the Washington consensus type of thinking, and tried to point out that the market failures were more serious than government failure were more serious than the market failures. So it's better to have, that price work, that market work, reduce government intervention. But if you look into those good performers, like East Asian economy, but in fact not only the East Asian economies, the World Bank in 2008 published a report called Growth Report, headed by Nobel Prize winners, Michael Spence. And they found that there was 13 economies in the world after the Second World War. They performed 7% growth rate continuously for 25 years, altogether 13 of them. If you look into what contributed to their success, and there are 5 status facts. I only mentioned 2. One is that they are all market economy. They all have credible, competent, proactive government. So that means you need to have a market function, but you also need to have a government to facilitate that. But the issue is that how to make the government facilitation really work. And recently, I published an article called the New Structural Economics, try to balance the role of the government as well as the market. And if you're interested, I think you can Google it and you can find that.
If we're going to be very strict and disciplined about things, we said we were going to move at 5:15. It's 5:15 now. We're going to go to outside the room. I believe that there are some refreshments there. But before you get up, we should properly thank each of the panelists for